The afternoon sun beat down on Maple Street, with that late summer intensity that makes asphalt shimmer and sweat bead on your forehead. Within seconds of stepping outside, it was the kind of heat that kept most people indoors with their air conditioning running full blast, which made the small figure standing at the corner of 5th and Maple even more noticeable to anyone who happened to drive past. She was maybe 7 years old, wearing a faded purple dress that had been washed so many times the color had turned almost gray, and she stood next to a pink bicycle that was clearly too small for her now, the kind of bike a parent buys for a 4-year-old expecting them to grow into it. In her small hands she held a piece of cardboard torn from a box, and written across it in careful childish letters were the words "For sale, cheap." Her name was Sophie Martinez, and she had been standing on that corner for 3 hours already, watching car after car drive past without stopping, her hope diminishing with each vehicle that failed to slow down. What she did not know was that her world was about to change in a way she could never have imagined, because rolling down Maple Street at that very moment were 4 Harley-Davidson motorcycles, their engines creating that distinctive rumble that makes windows rattle and hearts skip a beat. And riding those bikes were 4 members of the most notorious motorcycle club in America, the Hells Angels. The lead rider's name was Marcus Chains Donovan, a man whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. A reputation built over 30 years of riding with the club, and earning his patches through loyalty, courage and an uncompromising sense of justice that had nothing to do with courts or laws, and everything to do with an internal moral code that few people outside the Brotherhood could understand. He had gotten the nickname Chains not because he carried them as weapons, though that myth persisted in biker lore, but because when he was 19 years old and newly patched into the club, he had spent 3 months working in a factory making industrial chains, saving every penny, so he could buy his first Harley-Davidson. The chains he made during those 12-hour shifts became a symbol of his journey from poverty to freedom, from being trapped in the conventional world to choosing his own path. And when he finally bought that motorcycle with cash he had earned through honest labor, he had welded a section of chain from that factory to his handlebars as a reminder of where he came from and why he rode. Behind him rode 3 of his brother men, who had chosen him as their leader not because he was the toughest or the meanest, though he could certainly hold his own in a fight, but because he possessed something rare in their world, a combination of street wisdom, strategic thinking, and ability to see through lies and manipulation that made him almost impossible to deceive. Bear, whose real name was Thomas Grant, had earned his nickname not just because of his size, which was considerable at 6 feet 4 inches and 280 pounds, but because of an incident 5 years earlier when he had literally fought off a black bear that had wandered into their campsite during a rally in Montana, wrestling the animal away from a terrified prospect who had frozen in fear. Gunner, born James Rodriguez, had been a Marine before joining the club, had served 2 tours in Iraq and come home with medals for valor and nightmares that woke him screaming most nights, until he found his true family among the Hells Angels. And preacher, whose government name was David Washington, had actually studied theology for 2 years before dropping out of seminary, not because he lost his faith but because he realized that the church was more interested in maintaining its power structure than in actually helping people, and he had found more genuine spirituality and moral purpose among outlaws than he ever found among the ordained. They were not riding through this neighborhood by accident. They were heading back to their clubhouse after a meeting with another Chapter 2 counties over. They had chosen this route specifically because it avoided the main highways, where state troopers like to set up speed traps targeting bikers, especially bikers wearing the Hells Angels insignia on their leather vests. If you believe that every child deserves to eat, that no mother should have to watch her daughter go hungry while wealthy people waste food every single day, then I need you to do something right now that takes only 2 seconds but makes all the difference in the world. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, and subscribe to this channel because stories like Sophie's need to be heard, and your support helps us share them with people who still believe in doing what is right even when it is difficult. Marcus saw the little girl first, his eyes trained by decades of riding to notice everything on the road, caught the movement of her small hand waving the cardboard sign as they approached. He raised his left hand in a signal his brothers understood immediately, and all 4 bikes began to slow, their engines dropping from a roar to a rumble, to a purr as they pulled over to the curb about 20 feet from where Sophie stood. The girl's eyes went wide, and for a moment Marcus thought she might run, because he knew what they looked like to civilians, 4 large men covered in tattoos tearing leather vests, decorated with patches that most people associated with violence and crime, riding machines that cost more than most people's cars. But Sophie did not run. Instead she clutched her sign tighter and took a small step forward, and that tiny gesture of courage in the face of fear told Marcus more about this child's situation than any words could convey. He killed his engine and kicked down the stand, dismounting with the practiced ease of a man who had been riding motorcycles since before he was legally allowed to drive. His brothers followed suit, and the four of them approached the little girl slowly, carefully, in the same way you might approach a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. Marcus knelt down when he got within a few feet of her, bringing his eyes level with her, and he could see now that she had been crying, could see the tear tracks cutting through the dust on her face, could see the exhaustion and desperation in those young eyes that should have been full of joy and innocence instead of worry and fear. He spoke gently, his voice soft despite the rough exterior that made most people avoid eye contact with him. "What are you selling, little one?" Sophie looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her trying to decide whether to trust him, could see the calculation happening behind those young eyes as she weighed her fear against her need. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. "My bike," she said. "I am selling my bike." Marcus glanced at the pink bicycle, and he knew without asking that this was probably the only thing of value the child owned, the kind of gift a parent saves up for months to buy, the kind of present that gets wrapped in bright paper on a birthday or Christmas morning, while the parent watches with joy as their child's face lights up with excitement. He looked back at Sophie and asked her why she was selling something that clearly meant so much to hers, and the answer she gave him would stay with him for the rest of his life. Would become one of those moments that divides time into before and after, would change the trajectory of not just his day, but his understanding of what his brotherhood was supposed to stand for. "Mommy has not eaten in 2 days, Sophie whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. "I need to buy her food before she gets too sick," the medicine man said. "If she does not eat soon she might die." Behind Marcus he heard one of his brothers, a man called Bear because of his size and his temperament, let out a sound that was half curse and half sob. He heard Gunnar, the youngest of their group at only 26, mutter something under his breath about the injustice of a world where children had to sell their toys to feed their parents. He heard Preacher, who had earned his nickname not from any religious devotion, but from his tendency to deliver long speeches about right and wrong, say quietly that they needed to hear the whole story before they did anything. Marcus agreed, but he already knew what they were going to do, had known at the moment Sophie said those words, because the Hells Angels might be outlaws and criminals in the eyes of the law, that they had their own code, their own sense of honor, and that code absolutely forbade allowing a child to suffer when they had the power to help. Marcus asked Sophie where she lived, and she pointed to a small house 3 blocks away, a house that even from this distance looked like it was one strong wind away from collapsing, with peeling paint, and a roof that sagged in the middle, and windows covered with cardboard because the glass had probably been broken and never replaced. He asked her about her mother, and Sophie told him in that matter-of-fact way that children have when they are describing something terrible that has become normal to them. She told him her mother's name was Elena Martinez. She had worked as a seamstress in a factory downtown, until 6 months ago, when the factory owner, a man named Richard Castellano, had fired her along with 30 other workers because he said he could pay people in another country less money to do the same work. She told him that her mother had tried to find other jobs, but nobody wanted to hire someone who only spoke broken English and had no other skills besides sewing. She told him about how the bills kept coming, how the electricity got shut off, how the water got shut off, how they had been eating once a day, and then once every other day, and now not at all because there was simply no money left, and no food in the house. As Sophie taught her, Marcus felt something burning in his chest, that familiar rage that came from witnessing injustice, but this time it was different. More personal because he was looking at the face of innocence destroyed by greed, was seeing the direct human cost of decisions made by wealthy men in comfortable offices who never had to look at the consequences of their actions. He thought about Richard Castellano, a name he knew because everyone in the city knew it, a man who owned half the commercial real estate downtown, who drove a different luxury car every day of the week, who threw parties that got written about in the society pages where he posed for photographs with politicians and celebrities, while children 3 miles away were starving because he had decided their mothers were not worth paying a living wage. Marcus made a decision in that moment, the kind of decision that defines who you are as a person, the kind of choice that determines whether you are someone who just talks about justice, or someone who actually does something about it. He reached into the inside pocket of his leather vest and pulled out his wallet, and from that wallet he removed every bill he had, maybe $300 in cash that he had been planning to use for parts for his bike and beer for the weekend. He folded the money carefully and held it out to Sophie, and when she just stared at it in confusion, he closed her small hand around the bills and said firmly, "You keep your bike, little one. You take this money right now and you go buy food for your mother. You buy chicken and rice and vegetables and fruit and milk and bread and anything else you need. Then you come back here in 1 hour, And my brothers and I are going to follow you home and meet your mother, because we are going to make sure nobody in your family goes hungry ever again. Do you understand me?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. Real tears this time, not from sadness but from relief and gratitude and the overwhelming emotion that comes when you have given up all hope and then suddenly someone reaches out a hand to pull you back from the edge. She nodded, unable to speak, and then she did something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. She dropped the cardboard sign, threw her small arms around his neck and hugged him with all the strength in her tiny body, and Marcus hugged her back carefully, mindful of his size and strength, feeling something inside him break and reform into something better. When Sophie finally let go and climbed onto her pink bicycle and rode away toward the store 3 blocks over, Marcus stood up and turned to face his brothers, and they all knew without speaking what had to be done next. They had an hour before Sophie returned, and they used that hour to make phone calls. Bear called the clubhouse and spoke to the treasurer about accessing the club's emergency fund, the money they kept for situations exactly like this, for times when one of their own needed help, or when they encountered someone who needed defending or supporting. Gunnar called his girlfriend who worked at the county social services office, and asked her quietly off the record what programs might be available for a single mother with a child who had lost her job through no fault of her own. Preacher called a lawyer he knew, a woman who did pro bono work for people who could not afford legal representation, and asked her about wrongful termination lawsuits, and whether there was any recourse for workers who had been fired so a corporation could increase its profit margins. And Marcus called a contact he had in the local news, a reporter who owed him a favor from years ago, and he started asking questions about Richard Castellano, about his business practices, about the factory closing, about whether there were other families suffering the same fate as Elena Martinez. The reporter, a woman named Sarah Chen who had built a career, exposing corruption and standing up for the powerless, even when it cost her friendships and career opportunities, was immediately interested. She had been hearing rumors about Castellano for years, whispers about unsafe working conditions, allegations of wage theft, complaints about sexual harassment that were mysteriously settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements that kept victims silent. She had wanted to investigate him for a long time but had never found anyone willing to go on record, never had enough evidence to justify the resources required for a major investigation, never had the smoking gun that would make editors willing to take on someone as wealthy and connected as Richard Castellano. But now Marcus was offering her exactly what she needed: real victims with real names and faces, documentation of the factory closure, evidence of the financial calculations that had led to 30 families being thrown into poverty so that shareholders could see slightly better quarterly returns. Sarah agreed to meet with Marcus that evening at a diner on the edge of town, a place frequented by truckers and night shift workers, the kind of establishment where a reporter and a biker could talk without drawing attention or being overheard by people who might report back to Castellano. When Sophie returned an hour later, carrying 2 grocery bags that looked almost as big as she was, the 4 Hells Angels followed her back to her house on their motorcycles, and the neighbors came out to watch because seeing 4 bikers slowly rolling down that poor street was not something that happened every day. Sophie led them to the small house with the sagging roof, and when they knocked on the door, it was opened by a woman who looked like she had aged 20 years in the past 6 months, a woman so thin that Marcus could see every bone in her face, a woman whose eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle for so long that you have forgotten what hope feels like. Elena Martinez looked at the 4 large tattooed men standing on her porch, and at her daughter standing beside them smiling for the first time in months, and she did not know whether to be frightened or confused or grateful. Marcus introduced himself and his brothers, and he explained in simple terms that they had met Sophie, that they understood her situation, and that they were there to help. Elena's first instinct was to refuse, because she was a proud woman who had always worked for everything she had, and had never asked for charity, but Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, could see pride warring with desperation, could see the moment when she looked at her daughter and realized that her pride was worth less than her child's well-being. She invited them in, and they sat in her small living room on furniture that had been nice 20 years ago, but was now held together with duct tape and hope, and Elena told them her story in more detail than Sophie had been able to provide. She had come to America 15 years ago from Guatemala, fleeing violence and poverty, hoping to build a better life for herself and for the daughter she would later have. The journey north had been treacherous and terrifying, crossing rivers and deserts, hiding from border patrol, traveling in trucks with 30 other people crammed into spaces meant for cargo, going days without food or clean water, witnessing people die from heat stroke and dehydration, and simply giving up hope. She had paid a coyote $3,000 that she had borrowed from family members, who themselves had nothing, money they would spend years trying to pay back, and that debt had hung over her like a cloud even after she successfully crossed the border and found work in California, picking strawberries, after 2 years of agricultural work that destroyed her back and her hands, work that paid below minimum wage, because she was undocumented and had no leverage to demand better. She had managed to save enough money to buy a fake social security card and apply for the job at Cassiano's textile factory. She had worked hard, had learned English well enough to get by though she still struggled with complex conversations, had found steady work at the factory sewing shirts and dresses and pants that would be sold in department stores for 10 times what she was paid to make them. She had been so grateful for that job, so relieved to be working indoors with air conditioning, instead of out in fields where the sun beat down mercilessly and supervisors threatened to call immigration if you complained about anything. She had met Sophie's father at the factory, another immigrant who operated the cutting machines, and they had planned to get married and build a life together. But 2 months after Sophie was born, he was deported after a routine traffic stop revealed his legal status, and Elena never saw him again despite her letters and phone calls to relatives in Mexico who promised to pass along messages but probably never did. So she raised Sophie alone, working overtime whenever it was offered, sacrificing everything for her daughter, living in the cheapest apartment she could find so she could save money for Sophie's education, for her future, for the opportunities that Elena herself had never had. She had never been late, never missed a day of work, had even worked through a severe case of the flu, because she could not afford to lose the pay and was terrified that calling in sick might get her fired. She had worked on Thanksgiving and Christmas when they needed to fill rush orders, had trained new employees even though she received no extra compensation for doing so, had been praised by supervisors for her speed and the quality of her work. But 6 months ago, Richard Castellano had called a meeting and announced that he was closing the American factory and moving all production overseas, where labor was cheaper, where he did not have to pay benefits or follow safety regulations, or deal with workers who expected to earn enough to actually live on. Elena and 30 other women, most of them immigrants, most of them with children, had been given 2 weeks' notice and a severance package that amounted to less than 1 month's rent. Since then Elena had applied for every job she could find, but she had no car so she could only look for work within walking distance, and in this neighborhood there were not many businesses hiring. She had gone to 3 different temp agencies, but they all said the same thing, that they had more workers than jobs, and she would be put on a waiting list that she knew meant she would never get called. She had tried to get food stamps but the application process was so complicated and required so many documents that she did not have that she had given up after the 3rd rejection. She had sold everything of value in her house, every piece of jewelry, every electronic device, every piece of furniture except the bare minimum they needed to live. She had borrowed money from friends but they were all struggling too and could only spare a little. She had fallen behind on rent, and received an eviction notice that gave her 30 days to pay or leave, and that deadline was now only 5 days away. She had tried to shield Sophie from the worst of it, had told her daughter that she was on a diet when she skipped meals, had made up stories about job interviews that went well when the truth was nobody was hiring, had kept smiling and staying positive, even as she felt herself slowly dying from malnutrition and stress, and the crushing weight of failure. As Marcus listened to Elena's story, he felt his anger growing, felt that burning sensation in his chest intensifying, felt his jaw clenching and his fists tightening until his knuckles turned white. He was angry at a system that allowed hard-working people to be discarded like garbage the moment they were no longer profitable. He was angry at a society that measured success by wealth and treated poverty as a moral failing rather than a structural problem. He was angry at Richard Castellano specifically, at the casual cruelty of a man who could destroy 30 families without losing a single night's sleep, who could condemn children to hunger while he ate gourmet meals and drove luxury cars and lived in a mansion that could house 20 families comfortably. But more than anger, Marcus felt determination, because anger without action is just noise, and the Hell's Angels were men of action. He told Elena that they were going to help her, and when she tried to protest, he raised a hand and spoke with the kind of authority that made it clear this was not a negotiation. He told her they would pay her rent for the next 6 months while she got back on her feet. He told her they would make sure her refrigerator stayed full and her utilities stayed on. He told her they would connect her with a lawyer who would look into whether Castellano had violated any labor laws when he fired her. He told her that Sophie would never have to sell her bicycle or anything else ever again, and then he told her the most important thing, the thing that would change everything. He told her they were going to make Richard Castellano pay for what he had done, not with violence, because that was not what this situation called for, but with something more powerful and more permanent. They were going to destroy his reputation, expose his greed and make sure that everyone in the city knew exactly what kind of man he really was beneath the expensive suits and charitable donations. Elena looked at Marcus with tears streaming down her face, and she asked him a question that he would think about for months afterward. She asked him why would 4 strangers, 4 men who owed her nothing, 4 members of an outlaw motorcycle club that society viewed as criminals and thugs, why would they go to such lengths to help her and her daughter? Marcus thought about his answer for a moment, and then he told her something he had never articulated before but had always known deep down. He told her that the world was full of people who looked the other way when they saw injustice, who made excuses for cruelty, who valued profit over people and convenience over compassion. He told her that he and his brothers had made a choice long ago to be different, to be the kind of men who stood up for those who could not stand up for themselves, to use their strength not for personal gain but for protection and justice. He told her that the Hells Angels were called outlaws because they did not accept the rules of a corrupt system, because they had their own code of honor that was more important to them than laws written by politicians who had never known hunger or fear or desperation. And he told her that every single one of them, despite their rough exteriors and criminal records, had been that hungry child or that desperate parent, or that person standing at the edge of giving up at some point in their lives, and they remembered what it felt like to have no hope, and they had sworn to each other that whenever they had the power to give someone else hope, they would do it without hesitation. If this story is touching your heart, if you believe that real strength is not about how tough you are but about how you use your power to protect the vulnerable, then I need you to do something for me right now. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that good people still exist in this world. Leave a comment and tell me about a time when a stranger helped you when you needed it most. And subscribe to this channel because we tell stories about real people doing real good, and your support helps us reach millions of people who need to hear that compassion is not dead in America. Over the next 3 days, Marcus and his brothers worked harder than they had ever worked on anything in their lives. They spent hours on the phone coordinating with other Hells Angels chapters, organizing a relief fund for all the families who had been affected by the factory closure, collecting donations from bikers across 3 states who heard about what had happened and wanted to help. Gunnar worked with his girlfriend to cut through the bureaucratic red tape and get Elena enrolled in every assistance program she qualified for, from food stamps to housing assistance to job training programs that could give her new skills and new opportunities. Preacher worked with the pro bono lawyer to gather evidence about Castellano's business practices, interviewing other workers who had been fired, documenting the conditions they had worked under, building a case that might not result in criminal charges but could certainly result in civil penalties and massive negative publicity. And Marcus focused on the most important part of their plan, the part that would hurt Richard Castellano where it really mattered. Not in his bank account because fines and lawsuits were just the cost of doing business for men like him, but in his reputation, in his standing in the community, in his ability to maintain the facade of being a generous philanthropist, an upstanding citizen. Marcus contacted every reporter he knew, not just the one who owed him a favor but every journalist who had ever covered business or human interest stories in their city. He gave them Elena's story, gave them the stories of the other 29 women who had been fired, gave them documents showing how much money Castellano had saved by moving production overseas, gave them photographs of families living in poverty while Castellano lived in obscene luxury. He made sure they had everything they needed to write stories that would be impossible to ignore, stories with faces and names, and details that would make readers feel something into that would transform abstract concepts, like corporate greed and income inequality, into concrete human suffering that could not be dismissed or forgotten. The first story ran in the city's main newspaper on a Sunday morning, taking up the entire front page of the local section. The headline read, "The Real Cost of Coke Profit," and beneath it was a large photograph of Sophie standing next to her pink bicycle holding her for sale sign. The article told Elena's story in detail, described how she and other workers had been discarded without regard for their well-being, quoted labor experts, explaining how this was part of a larger pattern of American companies prioritizing shareholder profits over worker welfare, and prominently featured Richard Castellano's name and photograph alongside descriptions of his wealth and lifestyle. By Monday morning the story had been picked up by television news, with reporters standing outside Castellano's mansion and his downtown office building, interviewing former employees, and asking tough questions about business ethics and corporate responsibility. By Tuesday the story had gone viral on social media, with thousands of people sharing it, and adding their own comments about the injustice of the situation, with activists organizing protests outside Castellano's property, with customers announcing boycotts of any stores that sold products made in his factories. By Wednesday Castellano's lawyer was calling the newspaper demanding a retraction, threatening lawsuits for defamation, claiming that everything in the articles was misleading and taken out of context. But the newspaper stood by its reporting, and more stories followed, each one adding new details, new voices, new evidence of a pattern of behavior that could no longer be defended or denied. By Thursday night, Richard Castellano's carefully crafted public image was in ruin. His name had become synonymous with corporate greed and heartless exploitation, and business partners were distancing themselves from him, while politicians who had accepted his campaign donations were quietly returning the money and removing his name from their donor list. Through all of this, Marcus and his brothers kept a low profile, never giving interviews, never taking credit, letting Elena and the other workers be the faces of the story, while they worked behind the scenes to make sure the pressure kept building. They organized a fund that raised over $200,000 for the displaced workers, money that came from bikers, from labor unions, from progressive activists, from ordinary people who heard about what had happened and wanted to help. They coordinated with lawyers to file a class action lawsuit on behalf of all 30 workers who had been fired, seeking compensation for lost wages and benefits, and emotional distress. They worked with community organizers to create a support network for Elena and the others, connecting them with job opportunities and housing assistance, and childcare and all the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. And they watched with satisfaction as Richard Castellano, a man who had thought himself untouchable because of his wealth and connections, learned the hard way that money cannot protect you when the truth about who you really are becomes public knowledge. His business suffered as clients moved to competitors who had not been publicly exposed as exploiting workers, as major retail chains quietly removed his products from their shelves, as fashion brands that had contracted with him for years suddenly announced they were taking their business elsewhere. His social standing crumbled as friends and associates found excuses to avoid him at events and gatherings, as country club memberships were quietly revoked, as charity boards asked him to step down from positions he had held for decades. His wife, a woman who had enjoyed the lifestyle his money provided but had never questioned where that money came from or what it cost other people, filed for divorce and took half his assets in the settlement, telling reporters that she was ashamed to have been associated with someone who could cause such suffering without remorse. His children, attending expensive private schools where their classmates had seen the news coverage, faced bullying and ostracism, were uninvited from parties and social events, came home crying asking why their father had hurt all those families, forcing him to confront the reality that his actions had consequences not just for him but for everyone connected to him. His political influence evaporated as elected officials realized that being connected to him was now a liability rather than an asset, as senators who had once taken his calls now sent him to voicemail, as the mayor who had given him a key to the city in a ceremony 5 years earlier now refused to be photographed with him. The lawsuits began piling up, not just from the workers but from investors who claimed he had damaged their interests, from business partners who felt betrayed, from community groups seeking damages for the harm his factory closure had caused to the neighborhood economy. 3 months after Marcus first met Sophie on that hot afternoon selling her bicycle, Richard Castellano stood in his office, looking out at the city he had once viewed as his personal kingdom, and he realized that he had lost everything that mattered. Not his money, because he still had plenty of that, but his reputation, his influence, his place in society, all the things that had made him feel powerful and important. He had learned a lesson that every tyrant eventually learns, that power built on exploitation and cruelty is always temporary, that those you step on during your climb to the top will be waiting for you when you fall, and that true strength comes not from how much you can take from others, but from how much you are willing to give. The Hells Angels did not celebrate their victory with a party or a rally or any kind of public recognition. That was not their way. Instead, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, 4 months after this story began, Marcus and his 3 brothers rode their motorcycles back to the small house where Elena and Sophie lived, except it was not the same house anymore, using money from the relief fund and their own labor, working with other club members and volunteers from the community who had heard about what happened and wanted to help, working through weekends and evenings after their regular jobs. They had renovated the entire structure over the course of 3 months. They had replaced the sagging roof with new shingles and proper support beams, had torn out broken windows and installed new double-pane glass that would keep the house warm in winter and cool in summer, had stripped away decades of peeling paint and applied fresh coats in bright, cheerful colors that Elena and Sophie had chosen themselves from sample cards at the hardware store. They had crawled under the house to repair ancient plumbing that leaked and wasted water, had rewired the entire electrical system to modern code, so Elena would not have to worry about fires or power failures, had installed new appliances in the kitchen, including a refrigerator that actually kept food cold and a stove with all 4 burners working. They had refinished the hardwood floors that had been hidden under worn linoleum, had patched holes in walls and replaced damaged drywall, had installed new light fixtures that brightened every room, had built custom shelves and storage spaces to maximize the small square foot. They had furnished the home with donations from club members and community supporters, furniture that was gently used but clean and comfortable, a real dining table where Elena and Sophie could eat meals together, a sofa where they could sit and watch television or read books, beds with new mattresses that did not sag or poke through with springs. They had even created a small garden in the backyard, building raised beds and filling them with soil and planting vegetables and herbs that Elena could harvest, teaching Sophie about growing food and being self-sufficient, giving them not just a house but a home, not just shelter but dignity and pride. Elena met them at the door, and she looked like a different person from the exhausted, desperate woman Marcus had first encountered. She had gained back the weight she had lost, her eyes were bright and alert, her smile was genuine and reached all the way to her eyes. She had found a new job working at a local community center teaching sewing and textile arts to young people, a position that paid less than the factory but came with benefits and respect, and the satisfaction of doing work that mattered. She had enrolled in English classes at the community college, and was working toward her citizenship. She had paid off all her debts, and was saving money for the first time in years. She had a future again, not just survival day to day, but actual plans and dreams and possibilities. And so sweet little Sophie, who had been willing to sell her most precious possession to save her mother, came running out of the house with that pink bicycle that she still rode every day, even though she was getting too big for it, because it represented something more important than just transportation. It represented the moment when her life changed, when 4 strangers showed her that the world still had good people in it, when she learned that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. She threw her arms around Marcus, just like she had done that first day, and he hugged her back with the same careful gentleness, and he thought about how this one small act of kindness had rippled out in ways he could never have predicted, changing not just Elena and Sophie's lives, but his own, reminding him why he had joined the Hells Angels in the first place, reconnecting him to the core values that had gotten lost somewhere along the way, during decades of living on society's margins. Before they left that day, Marcus gave Elena something that he and his brothers had worked on in secret for the past month. It was a leather vest, custom made to fit her, with patches carefully sewn on by Bear's girlfriend who was a professional seamstress. The vest was not a Hells Angels cut, because she was not a member of the club, and never would be by their rules, but it carried its own patches that told its own story. On the back was an image of a pink bicycle surrounded by flames, and beneath it the words "Honorary Sister, protected by the Hells Angels." On the front were patches commemorating her courage, her resilience, her refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. Marcus explained to her that she was now under their protection, that anyone who tried to harm her, or her daughter would have to answer to the entire organization, that she was part of their extended family now whether she wore their colors or not. Elena cried when he gave it to her, and she put it on immediately, and Marcus saw the pride in her eyes, the recognition that she had survived something that would have broken most people, that she had come through the fire and emerged stronger. As Marcus and his brothers rode away from that house that afternoon, the sun setting behind them painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, they passed that same corner where Sophie had stood 4 months earlier trying to sell her bicycle. The spot looked different now, not because anything physical had changed but because they saw it through different eyes, eyes that had witnessed transformation, eyes that had seen hope restored, eyes that understood more clearly than ever that their purpose in this life was not just to ride motorcycles and wear patches and live outside society's rules, but to use their strength and their brotherhood to protect those who could not protect themselves, to bring justice where the system failed, to be the kind of men who stood up and did something when everyone else looked away. The story of Sophie and Elena spread through the Hells Angels community and beyond, becoming the kind of legend that gets told and retold around campfires and in clubhouses, the kind of tale that reminds people what the brotherhood is really about beneath all the stereotypes and misconceptions. Other chapters started their own relief funds and community programs, started looking for families who needed help, started using their collective power not just for their own benefit but for the benefit of their communities. The Oakland chapter started a food bank that operated out of their clubhouse, feeding hundreds of families every month with no questions asked and no judgment passed. The Phoenix chapter created a scholarship fund for children of single parents, recognizing that education was often the path out of poverty, but was inaccessible to kids whose parents were struggling just to keep food on the table. The Chicago chapter began escorting victims of domestic violence to safe houses, using their intimidating presence to ensure that abusive partners did not follow or try to prevent women from leaving dangerous situations. The Seattle chapter started a job training program, teaching motorcycle mechanics to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, giving them marketable skills and a path to steady employment. The Martinez family story became a template proof of concept that showed what was possible when people with resources and courage decided to take action instead of just feeling sorry about problems and moving on. When the tough guys decided to use their toughness for protection rather than intimidation, when outlaws chose to break unjust rules in order to uphold higher moral principles. News of these programs spread through social media and word of mouth, and soon people who had never met a biker in their lives were reaching out to local chapters asking for help or offering to volunteer or donate resources. The stereotype of the Hells Angels as dangerous criminals began to not disappearing entirely, because the club had certainly earned some of its fearsome reputation through legitimate acts of violence and lawbreaking, but becoming more nuanced, more complex, more accurate to the reality that most members were working-class men who had chosen brotherhood and loyalty over the atomized individualism of mainstream society. Men who would rather help a struggling single mother than donate to a political campaign or buy a timeshare. Men whose moral code might conflict with legal code, but who lived by principles of honor and justice that many wealthy and supposedly respectable citizens had long ago abandoned in pursuit of profit and status. Richard Castellano eventually settled the class action lawsuit for an undisclosed amount that lawyers said was substantial enough to compensate all 30 workers fairly and send a message to other business owners that there are consequences for treating employees as disposable. He sold his textile business to a cooperative that promised to bring manufacturing back to America and pay workers fair wages. He retreated from public life, and while some people felt sorry for him and said the punishment had been too harsh, most people felt that justice had been served, that he had gotten exactly what he deserved, that the world was better off with one fewer exploitative billionaire wielding unchecked power over vulnerable workers. For Elena and Sophie, life continued to improve in ways both large and small. Sophie excelled in school, inspired by the knowledge that her mother's struggles had been for something, motivated by a desire to honor the sacrifice and strength she had witnessed. She started a program at her school, collecting bicycles and other items to donate to families in need, understanding from personal experience how much small gestures could mean to people who had nothing. She never forgot that day when 4 scary-looking bikers stopped to help a desperate little girl, never forgot the lesson that you cannot judge people by their appearance, that sometimes the people society fears are the ones who have the biggest hearts and the strongest sense of justice. Elena became an advocate for workers' rights, speaking at community meetings and labor rallies, sharing her story to help other people understand the human cost of corporate decisions, working to change laws and policies that allowed companies to treat employees as expendable. She started a support group for other immigrant women who had lost jobs or were struggling to make ends meet, creating the kind of community safety net that should have existed all along but did not because society had failed them. She taught sewing classes not just to earn money but to pass on skills and knowledge, to empower other women to create and build, and have agency over their own lives. She wore her honorary sister vest with pride everywhere she went, and whenever someone asked about it she told them the whole story. Told them about the day 4 Hells Angels showed up and changed everything. Told them that real heroes do not always wear capes and badges, sometimes they wear leather and ride motorcycles, and have criminal records. Sometimes the people who save you are the ones you were taught to fear. Before we end this story, I need you to understand something important. What happened to Elena and Sophie was not random luck. It was not a fairy tale or a miracle. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people who decided that they would not accept a world where children go hungry, while billionaires hoard wealth. Marcus and his brothers could have ridden past Sophie that day without stopping. They could have given her a few dollars and moved on with their lives feeling like they had done their good deed for the day. They could have looked the other way like so many other people did, could have told themselves that it was not their problem, that they had their own troubles to worry about. But they did not do any of those things. They stopped, they listened, they acted, they used their power and their resources and their brotherhood to make real change happen, and that is something any of us can choose to do when we encounter injustice or suffering, or need. So here is what I need you to do right now. If this story moved you, if it made you angry about what Elena went through or inspired by what the Hells Angels did, if it reminded you that individual actions matter and that ordinary people have the power to change lives, then do not just feel those emotions and move on to the next video. Take action, share this story so that other people can hear it, and be inspired to help someone in their own community. Look around your own neighborhood and your own city and find someone who needs help, whether it is a homeless person who needs a meal, or a single parent struggling to pay bills, or an elderly person who needs assistance, and do something concrete to help them. Volunteer your time or donate money or simply pay attention, and offer kindness to people whose society has forgotten or discarded. Join or support organizations that fight for workers' rights and economic justice. Vote for politicians who prioritize people over profits. Set life up when you see exploitation or cruelty or injustice. Refuse to be a passive observer in a world that desperately needs active participants. And subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories like this one every single week. Stories about real people overcoming real challenges. Stories about communities coming together to support their own. Stories about justice and redemption, and the fundamental truth that most people are good and want to do the right thing if they are given the opportunity and the support to do so. Your subscription costs nothing but helps us reach more people, helps us tell more stories, helps us build a community of people who believe that a better world is possible if we all do our part. In the comments below, tell us about your own experiences with unexpected help or with helping others. Tell us about the bikers or other stereotyped groups who turned out to be heroes in your life. Tell us what you think Richard Castellano should have done differently. Tell us how we as a society can better protect vulnerable workers and ensure that no child ever has to sell their bicycle to feed their parent. Your voices matter, your stories matter, your ideas for solutions matter. This channel is not just about me telling stories, it is about all of us coming together to acknowledge problems and work towards solutions. The last time Marcus saw Sophie, she was 12 years old, tall and confident and thriving in ways that seemed impossible given where she had started. She had just won a regional science fair with a project about sustainable manufacturing and ethical business practices. Inspired by her mother's experience and determined to grow up to be the kind of person who created jobs and opportunities rather than destroying them. Her project had examined the true cost of outsourcing, calculating not just the financial savings for corporations, but the social costs for communities left behind, the environmental costs of shipping goods halfway around the world, the human costs of poverty and unemployment and family stress. She had proposed alternative models of business that prioritized stakeholder value over shareholder value, that measured success not just in quarterly profits, but in employee well-being and community health and long-term sustainability. Her presentation had been so compelling, her research so thorough, her passion so evident, that the judges had given her first place unanimous, and several had approached her afterward to say that her work had changed their thinking about capitalism and social responsibility. She still had that pink bicycle, too small for her now, but kept in her room as a reminder of the worst day that became the beginning of her best days, polished and maintained as carefully as if she rode it every day, displayed proudly where she could see it from her bed, and remember what her mother had sacrificed and what strangers had given, and how quickly everything can change when people choose compassion over indifference. And she still remembered the 4 scary-looking bikers who stopped when everyone else drove past, who saw a child in need and decided that nothing in their schedule or their life was more important than helping her, who proved to her at age 7 that the world still had good people in it, and that sometimes those good people looked nothing like what she had been taught to expect. She kept a photograph on her desk of that day, a picture that Bear had taken with his phone showing Marcus kneeling in front of her while she clutched her sign, and whenever she felt discouraged or overwhelmed by the world's problems, whenever she wanted to give up on her dreams of making a difference, she would look at that photograph and remember that individual actions matter, that one decision to stop and help can ripple outward in ways impossible to predict, that she exists as the person she is today because 4 men chose kindness over convenience on one hot afternoon. Marcus told people later that stopping to help Sophie that day was the most important thing he had ever done in his entire life, more important than earning his patches, more important than any ride or rally or brotherhood event, more important than anything else he could remember. Because in that moment he had a choice, and he chose compassion over convenience, chose action over apathy, chose to be the kind of person he wanted to exist in the world, and that choice rippled outward in ways he could never have predicted, changing not just 2 lives but dozens of lives, inspiring other people to help and to act, creating a wave of kindness and justice that continued to spread long after that hot afternoon when a little girl with a cardboard sign changed the course of multiple futures. He thought often about the moment he first saw Sophie standing on that corner, about how easy it would have been to just keep riding, to tell himself that he had places to be, and brothers waiting for him and problems of his own to worry about. He thought about all the other people who must have driven past her that day, Good people, probably people who went to church and donated to charity and considered themselves moral and ethical, but who did not stop because stopping would have been uncomfortable and inconvenient and would have required them to do more than just feel sorry for a few seconds before moving on with their day. He thought about how close Sophie and Elena had come to falling through the cracks completely, to becoming just another statistic about poverty and inequality, to being forgotten by a society that has plenty of resources to help everyone but chooses not to because helping requires sacrifice and discomfort, and acknowledging our interconnectedness. He thought about Richard Castellano and the thousands of other wealthy and powerful people who made decisions every day that destroyed lives, who prioritized profit over people without ever seeing the faces of those they harm, who insulated themselves from the consequences of their greed, with walls and gates and layers of bureaucracy that prevented them from having to confront the human cost of their choices. And he thought about the Hells Angels, about what the Brotherhood really meant, about why they wore those patches, and lived outside society's rules and had codes of honor that seemed archaic or even violent to outsiders, but made perfect sense to anyone who understood that official laws and systems were designed to protect property and power rather than people and justice. The Angels were called a criminal organization by law enforcement, were monitored by federal agencies, were banned from certain towns and establishments, were portrayed in media as thugs and gangsters and threats to public safety. But Marcus knew the truth that the club's critics either did not understand or deliberately ignored. The Hells Angels did more real good for real people than most churches or charities or government programs ever did, and they did it without asking for recognition or tax deductions or praise. That is the power we all have if we choose to use it. That is the difference one person or one group can make when they decide that they will not accept injustice, that they will not look away, that they will use whatever strength and resources they have to make things better. We do not need to be rich or powerful or famous to change lives. We just need to pay attention, to care, and to act when action is needed. We need to be the kind of people who stop instead of driving past, who listen instead of ignoring, who help instead of looking away. The world is full of Sophie Martinez moments, full of desperate people standing on corners with cardboard signs asking for help that most of us are too busy, or too uncomfortable, or too afraid to provide. We see them every day and we drive past, we walk past. We look at our phones and pretend not to notice, because noticing means feeling uncomfortable, means having to make a choice between convenience and compassion, means disrupting our carefully constructed lives to acknowledge someone else's suffering. We tell ourselves stories to justify our inaction, stories about how they probably brought it on themselves, how giving money might enable bad behavior, how we have our own problems and cannot be expected to solve everyone else's problems, how there are systems and programs and organizations designed to help people like that, so it is not our responsibility as individuals. But those stories are lies we tell ourselves to avoid the guilt of walking past suffering, when we have the power to alleviate it, lies that protect us from having to confront our own privilege and our own choices about how we use our resources and our time. Marcus and his brothers did not have more money than the average person who drove past Sophie that day. They did not have special training in social work or poverty alleviation. They were not saints or heroes in the conventional sense. They were just people who saw someone in need and decided that their own comfort and schedule and plans were less important than helping a child who was trying to sell her bicycle to feed her mother. That is all it takes. That is the entire secret. See the suffering, choose to care, take action. Everything else is just details and logistics that can be figured out if you are committed to the fundamental decision to help. The Hells Angels are called outlaws because they do not accept the rules of a system that allows children to starve while wealthy people waste resources. They are called criminals because they have their own code of justice that sometimes conflicts with laws written to protect property rather than people. They are feared by society because they look dangerous and because stereotypes are easier than understanding. But the truth is that some of the most moral and ethical people you will ever meet are wearing leather vests covered in patches, riding motorcycles that cost more than most cars, living outside the boundaries of conventional society. Precisely because they refuse to accept a world where might makes right, and money determines worth, and vulnerable people are left to suffer alone. So the next time you see a biker, the next time you see someone who looks scary or different, or outside the mainstream, remember Sophie and Elena. Remember that the 4 men who saved them were exactly the kind of people most of society tells you to fear and avoid. Remember that some of the strongest codes of honor exist outside the law, that some of the most compassionate hearts beat inside the chests of people with criminal records, that humanity and decency and justice, are not confined to those who look respectable and follow all the rules. Remember that we all have the power to be heroes in someone else's story if we just choose to stop and help when we see someone in need. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. Thank you for caring about Sophie and Elaine. Thank you for believing that justice and kindness still matter in this world. Now go out and prove it by being the person who stops when others drive past, the person who helps when others look away, the person who makes the world just a little bit better one action at a time. And we will see you in the next story, where once again we will show you that humanity and hope are still alive if you know where to look for them.